Hi everyone, my name is Kevin England and I'm here to present some information about getting prepared for springtime. I'm just going to run through this presentation that I put together. Given current times and the fact that we can't meet in person, I wanted to convey some information to our newer beekeepers just to give you some insights on and some comfort on how to approach spring. In order to talk about spring current day where it's really booming out there, we have to talk about what led up to that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the winter period coming into spring, so we could use that information to understand what's going on in spring right now. So the first thing I want to set the stage for is whether or not you can work in your hives. In the wintertime, you can't open your hives, it's too cold. It's a time where you're not operational. We're currently in the period where it's occasionally operational. You could look in on your hives on warm days, but you're not going to have them open every day. And it has to be a somewhat warm day in order for you to even consider that. Eventually, we're going to get to this point in spring or early summer where you're mostly operational. It doesn't matter what day it is, you can go in, but there will be an off day here or there where it's going to be a little cold and you're going to wait till tomorrow or a couple days. Then you'll get to a point in the summertime when you can go at any given time, anytime you want. That's when you're completely operational. If you think about the time frame of year, right now we're in mid-March to mid-April time frame, occasionally operational. It's the beginning of spring. At the time when we thought about earlier in March, there was no forage or just on the cusp of forage. There were some warmer days above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but it was still cold in the morning, meaning it was below 45 degrees. The important thing to consider is that 45 degrees is a good rule of thumb about when the bees will be operational. 45 degrees is the temperature where they'll break cluster and they'll take cleansing flights and they'll be operational inside the hive. So let's just keep that as a benchmark right now. I know that temperature range is up for discussion. That's not the point of it. The point of it is, are the bees operating inside the hive? Earlier this year, when you wanted to check in on your hive, you would take the roof off and you would look at the inner cover. If you saw this, where the bees were clustered and a lot of them, you knew your hive was doing fine. You could also use a FLIR camera to shoot where your hives were and how big the cluster was from the heat signature. If you think about it, the main concerns were, is your hive still alive and are there food stores? You would check for weight, or maybe you'd even pop the inner cover off on an unusually warm day, and you get those sometimes in January and February, and look to see what the stores look like or whether or not it had any heft to it. Your objectives in that time frame were food and bees. Do they have enough food? And if not, did you need to do something in an emergency feeding to get them through? And do they have enough bees? And unfortunately, when it's too cold, there's really not much you could do but just hope that they're going to get through. The key thing to understand about that time period is, if your bees were not big enough of a cluster to make it through, you have to consider how to make them healthier in the fall so that they get further along in the spring. In that time period, while they were still on the cluster, some people think it's time to treat. Occasional warm days where the bees were on the cluster, they would break the cluster and operate inside the hive. They would spread out a little bit. And on those warm days, you would see them flying. That provides an opportunity to do oxalic acid treatments. Bees are building brood at that time frame, but it's not that much capped brood. And most, if any, of the mites are phoretic, meaning on the bees themselves. And a treatment then is a good time period to knock them down and make your bees healthy and mite-free, at least in the beginning of the year. So it's become, over the last 2 to 3 years in this area, more and more commonplace that people are doing oxalic treatments in this time frame. Your colony state, if you do an assessment, hopefully it looks like the one in the picture here, but it usually ends up being one of these three. A dink, that's the name we give for something that has 1 to 3 frames. It may or may not make it through. If there's a lot of warm days, it'll probably go, but it's not going to take off in the spring. A moderate hive is probably what we see most, 4, 5, 6 frames of bees. That's not too bad coming out of winter. And of course, you're going to have some that are booming. They're not going to be frames of bees all the way across, but they could be 6, 7, 8 frames of bees in this time frame. Remember, we're talking about late February, early March into mid-March. And specifically, we're talking about New Jersey. We're in Hunterdon and Warren County. So now I want to talk about spring has almost arrived. We're getting to the middle of March, heading into April. The in-between period, bees have been building. So even though it was too cold to open the hives, from January to February, the bees have been building brood. They've been building bees. They've been growing, especially as it gets lighter during the day. So they do start to amass some form of colony size. And occasionally, again, 45 degrees, they're out doing cleansing and they're doing some foraging. Now it's still cold at night. In this time period, it's below 45 degrees. So when they get into the cool nights, they come back together on the cluster. But there's not that much in the way of forage. If they're lucky, they're going to find skunk cabbage, some crocus up, maybe the daffodils are going to break if it's an early spring. The thing you're looking for here is a forsythia bush. That's a great indicator in New Jersey. As soon as the forsythia bush breaks, a lot of times that means that forage is available in abundance, meaning enough to get started for springtime. It's not full-on nectar flow, but it is something where you can get going and you should start to understand the way the bees are going to operate. Now that takes me to a notion of which way do you treat your bees? Are you conservative or are you the more proactive beekeeper? In my years of keeping bees, I've tried both of these. On the conservative side, if the temps are below 45 overnight, but some days are in the 60s, you might peek in on your bees. And even on a rare 70-something today, you might open the top of your hive, but you're not going to do too much more. So conservative, you're not going to manipulate the hive because you know colder days are going to follow. Proactive, as soon as you get a warm day or a couple warm days, you're going to start doing your early spring management. You either ride one side or the other, and there's no right or wrong as to these. There's only times when occasionally the conservative person gets it right and the proactive person pays a little bit of a penalty if they're doing things wrong. We'll talk about management mindsets and which way these things go. We'll contrast them. On the conservative side, you're not doing spring reversals. You're not splitting. You're not doing any feeding other than dry feeding. Your goal is not to break the hive apart and open the propolis seals. Propolis is that sticky resin that seals the boxes around like caulk. And in the cold, it doesn't glue together. So if you break it, it's open. Now on the other side, proactive people, they will perform reversals if it makes sense and do cursory inspections, meaning lift frames out of hives and look at the brood patterns and so on. They're also going to possibly take early swarm prevention actions. And in some cases, depending on their objectives, they may even start feeding. On warm days, you could feed some liquid in small amounts to stimulate the bees. So there's two schools of thought, conservative, proactive. When it comes to what you do in the spring, it is all upon your mindset. A lot of people in this area have been taking to insulating their hives. Not an argument about whether it's good or bad, it's just that's what people are doing. So the conservative folks, leave it on. They figure there's colder days coming and it's better to leave it on there and let them take advantage of it. Proactive, there's schools of thought to leave it on, and there's schools of thought to take it off. Some think that when the sun comes across and hits your hives, it warms the hive, and that has some sort of biological impact to the hive to get it going. Where if it's insulated, the sun is not warming the hive. I think of it this way. Sometimes I feel like if I look at a polystyrene hive, they're controlling the temperature inside. And they're not making it hot and balmy because they're inside this insulated thing, but they do control the fluctuation of temperatures. And in my impression, I think they deal with swings better. The fluctuation between warm and cold days, you have that in the springtime. It's more stable if your hive is isolated, if your hive is insulated. So not to go into that, it's just, do you leave it on or take it off? Your choice. That is a preference thing. A conservative person is going to hold off, like we said, on inspections. They're just going to speculate by looking down through the top of the hive, how many bees are in there, what kind of stores they have. And then they can watch the front entrance on those warm days to see if bees are bringing in pollen and how operational they are. If there's orientation flights, they know the bees are alive. Proactive folks, that's not good enough. They're going to go in, they're going to look, they're going to open the hive, they're going to get a sense of how it's progressing. And in some benefits, they might be able to see what the drones are doing, which is a precursor to spring activities, and whether or not, if there's been a run later, any queen cells. So again, this is a preference thing, just pointing out which way you could go. A conservative person, they're not going to feed, as we said. A proactive person, they can build up by feeding small amounts, liquid feed. I think anybody would consider feeding solid feed. Some of the challenges when you are proactive feeding in the spring is you build up the hive and then it gets cold and the hive has to retract on the cluster and they don't have enough bees to cover all the brood they were building. That's a challenge. That's a risk. That's the way it goes. It deals in lost bees and a setback. And the other pieces, if you're not judicious about it, you can feed them too much. And if they're really ambitious, they're going to store it back into the brood chamber and they're going to create a condition where the queen can't lay, and that could possibly trigger swarm response. So if you're feeding, just follow the guidance. No more than a small amount every day, and keep track by doing inspections as to the fact that you're not overfeeding them and backing down into the brood chamber. Swarm prevention management. We're going to go through a bunch of different things that you could do in spring activities, but this is a proactive thing early in the season. Some get in right as soon as they get warm days and they swap their boxes, which we'll talk about. Some of them do pyramid up and checkerboarding right away to relieve congestion. All things are possible. And if you see a really booming hive, these things are not a terrible idea to attack. And we'll talk again about that. So then you get to the point where spring is imminent. It's 60 degrees above every day, or getting there, and the low temperatures are above 45, which means, our rule of thumb, bees are operational inside the hive. This is when things start to take off in anticipation of the nectar flow, which is right around the corner. Warm days and early plants are in bloom. Some plants bloom by temperature, some plants bloom by light, and certainly from mid to late March and into April, you start to see crocus, snowdrops, daffodils, skunk cabbage, some trees start to go, red maples, and so on. The indicator plant, as we talked about, is forsythia. That's when the blooms start to break here in central New Jersey. If you start to see that the hive is getting successive days of foraging, you can count on them growing, and they will probably at that point survive through spring. Once you see them out foraging and bringing back pollen, it's game on. You don't have to worry about survival at that point. Now, there are times when it's still cold at night, but low temps are often higher than 45. Now, spring is fickle beast sometimes. You're going to see times when you'll get a long run and then you'll get to April and it'll drop down to the 30s. And they talk about you need to plant your plants through to the first frost, which a lot of times they count on as being May. It's the same way with the bees. You do want to be cognizant and watching the weather. And if you're opening your hives and soon there's a cold snap coming, just be aware of what you're doing. Queen is laying once they're out going to get pollen. Early to mid-March, maybe the beginning of April, and certainly by the first or second week through the middle of April, that queen is laying. And it's the time when you start to see drones in our area. And this is where the bees will forage and rearrange their hive, their colony, for the upcoming season, however they want it. If they had storage, they might rearrange that. And they're certainly taking in nectar and pollen, and they'll start to store honey and create the rainbow effect over the brood and so on, along with feeding drones and all of the things. So queen's going to town. Everything is going. This is where you have to look at your colony size. On the first warm days, and sometimes even before, if you're peeking in and your hives are large, like the ones in the picture here, you're going to need to take action. These are the first hives that swarm. When you have bees that are bubbling out every time you open the cover, and you're just seeing a phenomenal amount of activity and resources coming and going, there's no doubt that this is a candidate for early intervention. Conservative or proactive, it doesn't matter. Now you're going to get to that day when you do the first full inspection. Low temperatures, if you're a conservative person, higher than 45, period a few days, next couple days. Sometimes it gets colder, but if you get a couple runs, and again, when you see a hive that's booming, you're going to have to do swarm control. But here's a good time to do reconnaissance and look and see what's going on inside your hive and make your plan. So reconnaissance, you're pulling frames, you're making notes, you're getting information, and you're trying to figure out how your plan is going to go, dink, moderate, booming hive, for your objective. You want to make honey, you want to make splits, you want to do queen rearing or whatever it is. Here on these warm days, you can start to think about, if you're a conservative person, whether you're going to do reversals, pyramid, expansion, add honey boxes, and so on, things we're going to cover. You may want to do several of these things. If you have multiple days where it's going to be warm, you could do reconnaissance the first day, make your plan that evening, and come back the second day and execute everything. Just figure out what you're going to do. A lot of times I like to go look and see what's going on. Sometimes I take action right away, and other times I build myself a plan and I'll come back maybe even the next weekend and figure out what's what. So we're talking about the end of March and the first couple weeks in April. And it all depends every spring on the weather. Sometimes it comes early and sometimes it comes later. I've said this before, I just want to make sure that it gets reiterated, because every year we have people who see their hives swarm, and you want to make sure they get nervous, especially young new beekeepers. They overfeed. They're afraid their bees are going to starve. There's this, I don't know what you call it, like this lament that occurs in the spring of, if you don't feed your bees right at the end, it would be a shame if they starved and didn't make it to spring. So beekeepers start feeding like crazy just to for an insurance policy and they end up having their hives swarm. So I'm going to reiterate again. You see on these hives, gallon feeders, don't do that. You need like a quart at most. That's the extent of it. If you're stimulating the colony in the spring, you have to keep stimulating them, keep feeding them until the full on nectar flow. Don't get them going and then take it off. You could slow it down if you've been over, but don't stop it until the nectar flow takes over. We're going to start talking about manipulations and things you could do to relieve congestion. The first thing is, and a common wisdom, it's been around forever. This is called a reversal. The left side shows that the brood has moved up into the top box. It's sitting underneath the inner cover. They've been fed well. They still have some stores, and you're going into spring. It is common wisdom from all the books that bees build up. Fact of the matter is bees build to the space they need, but bees build up. And if they sense space above them, they're content. So the premise here is take the top box and the bottom box off the bottom board and take the top box and put it on the bottom board and take what was the bottom box and put it over top. Pretty simple and straightforward. Here the bees will eat through whatever remaining honey they have above them, and they will push up into that top box. And because they have expansion room, they're not going to swarm. This is typical of a dink or a moderate. Usually if you have a booming, they're going to look like this. On the left side, you'll see that the booming hive will take up the top box and be pushing down into the bottom box. You don't want to do a reversal with this. You end up moving some of the brood in the bottom, which is fine, but then you leave some at the top of the second hive, and it gets abandoned, and sometimes when you get a cold snap, it all goes away. So don't do that. This is where I go back and challenge bees build up. Well, bees will build down, they'll build out, they'll build whatever. So go to the second one. Leave the bees alone and let them grow inside the cavity. They'll be fine. Preventative measure. Use of a slatted rack. This is not a common piece of equipment. Not a lot of people use them. But in the springtime, this is where it shines. If you take this device and you put it underneath the hive, it creates a buffer area, so it said, that prevents cold air from entering. The front has that large flat plateau, and when the air comes in the front, it doesn't come right up and go inside the hive. So a slatted rack is something that some beekeepers employ in the early spring. Some of them leave them on all year long. And the point too here is that it creates that insulated area below, and the queen in the bottom box will lay eggs all the way down to the bottom. So a slatted rack is something that people use in the springtime. They also use it for swarm prevention because it creates air and chamber and space and place for bees to hang out, but that's another lesson. The common sense thing to do in the spring, for eons, this is the way you handle it. Relieve congestion in the storage area by adding more boxes. And you do this before the major nectar flow. Take your hive and put your honey supers on top. Now, one of the things about this is you don't want to do it early, proactively, because if you look at the picture on the left, the bees are getting some residual heat hit the top of the roof under the inner cover, and it comes and keeps that honey warm. On the right side, it's going up and it's not doing anything. It's just passing through. So you want to do this when it's a little bit warmer, but certainly in advance of the nectar flow. The reason you want to do it in advance of the nectar flow is it lets the bees discover the space and they feel less congested. And when the bees start to get operational, sometimes the resting bees will go up into that open space and hide. And you might also consider an upper entrance so that when they start to store up there, they will use that entrance and not have to pass all the way through the hive. So first, most common thing is relieve congestion. Just give them more boxes up on top. Walter Wright out of Tennessee, the late Walter Wright, designed this concept. It's confusing a lot of people because it's used interchangeably with a lot of descriptions on how to manipulate your hive. If you're to be true, checkerboard, the term, is about opening up the honey dome so that bees can pass through. You break up the honey storage before the nectar flow, and you allow the bees to pass up. Now, one thing you can note about this diagram, the box on the right shows yellow on the top box. That means it's new equipment being added. So what you see here is the left box has a box added and it becomes the right stack, and every other honey frame has been moved up. And it creates a pathway, a channel up through the bees. Now this diagram shows it every other one where they are staggered. Sometimes people say you should move it up and over and create a full channel all the way up. It's one or the other, that doesn't really matter that much. The point here is that you're creating a pass-through for the bees to get through to the top box, and it relieves congestion. Again, you do this before the nectar flow. And again, you might consider an upper entrance to help the bees get right in to store. This is a concept where you're relieving congestion in the brood area. Now, sometimes people talk about every other frame in the brood area and call that checkerboarding. That's not what that is. Let me talk about pyramid up. What you do here is you take the box on the left where the brood is concentrated in the middle and it's starting to push into the top box, and you take the outer frames of the brood nest and you pull them up into the top box in the center over the mass. The point here is that it frees up the side of the box, and it assumes that a reversal was done and all the bees were down in the bottom. But when you rearrange the frame into this pyramid shape, what it does is it opens the side of the brood area. It allows for more storage on the horizontal side, left and right of the brood. And the other thing that occurs is when you move the brood up into the second box, it draws the bees up there to do brood in the second box, and they feel like they have more space. Now, obviously, one of the things that would happen right away is if they started to build a lot of brood right in the spring, you would put more boxes on top. That's where this one goes. The alternative option to pyramid up is if you had a super strong hive, you still need to relieve congestion. And here, the room for expansion comes by addition of an additional box, and you pyramid up above into the third box. Most bees, when they get to a full-size colony, as big as they're ever going to get, will only occupy 3 deeps. So here you can create 3 deeps, and they should not outgrow this space. And 3 deeps is a method, if you're interested in that, where you get the biggest workforce as possible. So this is a second form of pyramid up. It comes later when the bees are growing to a large. If you went for the first pyramid up and then it got congested again, you could go on one more level, or if you had a booming hive. We're going to switch now to talk about relieving congestion. This is a management practice, and we'll talk about a split, or it's called a divide in some places. In this case, you're literally going to make 2 colonies from one, and there are multiple ways to do that, and I'll go through a couple. You're going to take frames out of an original hive, put them in another one, and you're going to replace them, preferably with drawn comb, but sometimes you'll replace them with foundation if that's what you have. If you're going to replace them all and you do not have drawn comb, the common wisdom is to put it all together in the middle and put the foundation to the outside. This helps them retain the heat in the early spring. You don't want big divides. And bees need comb, in order to stay warm, they go inside the cells. Foundation doesn't work very well for that. Now, when it gets warmer, it's okay to put foundation right in the middle because they'll draw that out. They have the heat to make wax, and that's a later stage way to go. When you make a split, you take the queen with you. If you had a swarm, the queen leaves. So when you make a split and you're doing an artificial swarm, you're removing the queen and you're leaving the daughters to raise. First split, it's a walkaway. This is the easiest one for a beekeeper because you don't need to find a queen. You place a new bottom board on a second hive stand and you move the top box onto the bottom board and give it a roof. This is new equipment. And then you take the second box, which may or may not have the queen, and you put it down to a single. Or you could add another box to it. Here, I'm just saying you split it in half, literally. One of them has the queen. You don't know which one. But in this case, when the nectar flow is on and things are growing, who cares? They'll raise a queen, or you can source a queen and put it in the hive that shows no brood going forward and give them one. Incidentally, looking at the picture, purple indicates where brood would be, the brood nest. Red indicates where pollen is, and gold indicates where honey would be. And sometimes you'll see some brown, which indicates a regular frame with foundation. And then one more thing, you'll see ivory color, that's drawn comb. Just something about the color codes if you were wondering. A walkaway split, simplest thing to do in the spring. Now you're leaving it up to them to raise the queen. And sometimes that could be trouble, but a lot of times, especially, it's the perfect time for them. And if your box is so populous that they're gonna swarm anyway, you might as well keep your bees and do it this way. This is a single deep split. The same premise, new bottom board, second hive. You take 10 frames out of your 20 frames and you put it in your hive. And then from here, you're going to take the 10 frames that are left and you're gonna stack them up in the middle, and you're gonna add foundation, or in this case, I'm indicating drawn comb to the outside. You're taking the queen and putting it in the new hive because you're making a split. And the old one will raise a new one, or you can give a new queen to the original hive. Or if you're lucky enough, you found queen cells and you'll just let them emerge, and this colony will come to its own. So this is a single deep. Now, it seems funny to call it a single deep. You could do the same thing with a nuke. This is how you would make a nuke. In the original, you're going to take out a frame of capped brood, another frame of brood. A lot of times the second frame you choose is capped brood and open brood. Then you're going to take a food frame. It's good to pick a pollen frame, which will probably have some honey on it. And then of course they need honey, so you're going to take a honey frame. And a lot of times when you're creating a nuke, the last frame would be drawn comb to give them space to expand because they will grow rather quickly. And since we made a split, we gave them the queen. Now in this case, the original hive only lost 4 frames. And when they get a queen or make a queen or a queen emerges, they will recover quickly, and this hive will probably do well not to swarm and also still make a production colony for you to make honey. So this is a split, not into a full deep, but into a nuke. And then of course the nuke, when it takes off, you can give it a second box and keep growing it. Nukes, by the way, are perfect in spring because they build a lot of comb for you. So if you're in the purpose of needing comb, make yourself a split, make it a nuke, and then just keep growing it and it'll build comb like nobody's business for you. Demaree, there's going to come a time when you're going to open your hive and you're going to see queen cells and you're not going to be sure what to do. If you look in the hive that I have in the picture, there is, of course, a queen, but there's also queen cells, and this hive is ready to swarm. This is what you're going to do with this. It's going to take a minute to explain, but try and stay with me here. I'm going to take the 2 boxes that from the original hive, and I'm going to set them on the stand off to the side. On the bottom board, I'm going to put a new box. And in that box, from the original hive, I'm going to pull 2 to 4 frames. Brood, food, pollen. And I'm going to put the queen in there. On top of that, I'm going to put a medium. A medium with nothing in it. Could be foundation, ideally, and it could be drawn comb. I'm going to do this when it's warm. Obviously, the bees are going to build queen cells and prepare when it's time to swarm. So you should be in the height of the season. Over top of those 2 boxes, I'm going to put a queen excluder. And then I'm going to go over to the side bench and I'm going to take the 2 boxes that I had with all the original colony and I'm going to put them on top of the stack. In the original boxes should be all the queen cells. Certainly you're not going to take a queen cell and put it in the bottom box, only the queen. In the top, I'm going to go through and find all the queen cells. Shake the bees off so you don't miss any and pinch all the queen cells. Destroy them. Now make sure that you got the queen first or you're going to make yourself a queenless hive. Obviously you put it in the bottom box, so you should be good there. There is brood, both open, brood in all stages we call it, open and capped in the top box. So over the next X number of days, every 5 days or so, come back and check to see that the bees didn't build any more queen cells. If they do, pinch them. What will happen is, because there's no queen there will be no more source material over time, and they will not be able to build any more queen cells up there. In that context, you have thwarted swarming. No queens will emerge, and the bottom box will fill out with the queen and make a new colony, and the bees will still be able to pass back and forth through the queen excluder. In this context, when you're ready, you can pull the queen excluder out when swarming is no longer a problem, and you'll have one big massive colony. Now, the one thing that could happen is they could build up into that medium box. That's the cost of business. But you could pull the medium box out and bring the 2 down, and you'll have a 3 deep. This is a traditional Demaree method. Demaree was a guy who invented this process for swarm prevention and to build big colonies. Now, am I going to tell you this is the exact quote me, Demaree? This is the essence of it. There's 10 different resources out on the web, as you know, that tell you how to do a Demaree. To me, this is what I understand to be the traditional one. Now, what I'm going to do is take this principle and go in a different direction. I'm going to talk about a split, but in this split, you're going to do it all in one stack. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to move the queen down below. I'm going to put the medium on top, but I'm going to put a different piece of equipment. It's called a Snelgrove board. Snelgrove board is a divider or a double screen board. And what I'm going to do is create an entrance out the back for the top 2, and I'm not going to kill my queen cells. Those bees being far enough removed from the queen because of the separator will build a queen up top if they have queen cells. And the queen can go out and get mated, and this will become a 2-queen hive. And then eventually you could take that top box, top stack, 2 boxes, and move it off to a bottom board. Or some people go down to the original queen, which is older, and they pinch that queen and take the divider out and let the new queen rule the colony. This is an alternative if you don't want to kill the queen cells and you want to make a split. So just putting this out there. Everybody's going to be worried if you're new about swarming. You don't want your hives to swarm. It's a principle. The thing about swarming is it doesn't just happen. It's not spontaneous. We're going to do a presentation in the next couple days to a week talking about swarming and the triggers and the things that lead to it. But for right now, let's just say that you can look for drones, capped queen cells, and other things, and that forecasts when a swarm is going to occur. When you see these things, you have 10 to 20 days to act. And as you just saw, even if you saw queen cells, you can do something about it. So in this context, take a little time, learn what it means to see the triggers and indicators for swarms, and then know when to take the proper action. And if you know what to do, you can likely prevent swarming. Now, there's always a caveat to this. Sometimes swarms are going to swarm just for the sake of swarming. No matter what you do, they're just going to swarm. It has to do with their makeup and maybe the type of bee they are, or they've already got some sort of swarm trigger. Maybe you missed it, who knows? So caveat aside, it's not spontaneous. Drones and white wax. When you see drones, the whole point of a drone is that the drone is there to mate with virgin queens in order to procreate the colony. So it means that swarming is coming. That's normal. There's another thing that occurs is you see an abundance of younger bees coming out of winter, and those younger bees that are of a certain age are going to be able to build wax, and they need to be able to do that to go build the new home. They'll signal the flow and swarming season by building white wax in your hive. Sometimes you can open a hive, take the inner cover off, and look, and you'll see new white wax on the top of the frames. When they're ready to go, they're ready to go. So when you see these two things, you can almost guarantee that swarming is right around the corner. Now, timing of swarming, last slide. In New Jersey, we did a survey for a number of years, and it's April 15th. Now, that's not to say on April 1st, somebody's hive who's booming is not going to swarm in Cape May or Sussex County. It doesn't matter. It happens. Weather, elevation, forage size, colony, whatever it is, it happens. But when we did the survey year after year, you had occasional swarms in the first week or two in April. On April 15th, it started to go, and then towards the end, it was game on. And this was data from 13, 14, 15 that we captured. By the way, I host the swarm report, and the site is down. There's an error for some reason. Let's see if I can get that fixed. Sorry about that. But if you know enough about bees, swarming follows biology, and you could look for the indicators. So that's a good place to leave this. I want you to stay tuned to our channel. We're going to come back and talk about swarm indicators and things to look for, what causes swarming in more detail. Right now, what we wanted to do is talk to you about what's going on in your hives and things you should be prepared for in anticipation of spring. So we hope you found this useful. Leave any comments. If you're a Northwest member and you have questions, send an email to nwnjba@live.com. We'll be hosting regular sessions in light of COVID and what's going on. We're creating a place. Look for an email that will tell you where you can check in with us and ask questions and get some guidance. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you found this useful. And if you have any corrections or comments, please send feedback to nwnjba@live.com. Any questions are welcome. Be nice. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.